Hi, everyone. I'm excited to have you with us tonight. I'm Frank Mang, and I'm the UCLA Anderson Alumni Association Seattle Chapter President. Tonight's discussion is very important to all of us, and with the support of the UCLA Anderson Association, we are broadcasting this event to all our alumni from all chapters. Tonight, we are privileged to have two esteemed alumni with us who will be here to discuss the diversity imperative, why pursuing diversity, equity, and inclusion is more important than ever. Lin Yang will be moderating our discussion. Prior to Anderson, Lin was a journalist and now does executive communications at Microsoft. And fun fact, he also had a brief stint for the Howard Schultz presidential campaign this year. I'm sure many of us will have thoughtful, engaging questions, so please leave the questions in the chat box below, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end. And with that, I'll hand that to you, Lin.
All right. Thanks, Frank. Didn't know you were going to mention Howard Schultz. That was a very brief stint. I think it was a full 3 or 4 months before Howard pulled out of the presidential race. But I wanted to welcome everyone to this important discussion with Blair Taylor, who is actually a UCLA Anderson alum and
a Starbucks alum too.
And a Starbucks alum, right? And lives with us here in Seattle. Blair, very happy to have you with us. Your experience in the diversity and inclusion field is, very extensive. I wanted to just quickly let folks know kind of Blair's history. He has been serving in many roles, including being the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Urban League. He served, as he mentioned before, worked at Starbucks as the executive vice president and the chief community officer. And he was tapped after President Obama left office to be the CEO of My Brother's Keeper, which was President Obama, and still is, President Obama's signature National Urban Youth Development Initiative. And I think many of us have seen the tremendous events that My Brother's Keeper has run for a lot of kids in our urban areas. Bringing in all kinds of experts, celebrities, and resources for many of these the youth that were part of that program. Currently, Blair is a partner at PwC, where he co-leads the diversity and inclusion practice area, and works primarily in the people and organization side of PwC's consulting services. So Blair, thank you for joining us. And I'm just gonna kick it right off by, I think, doing kind of the first question that's been kind of run of the mill and very common in our strange times we live in, which is, how have you been doing lately?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just say thank you, and thank you for having me tonight. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to all of you who've tuned in. And I'm doing okay. First of all, it has been I think a challenging time for the country, and certainly for African Americans over the last several weeks, what we've seen across the nation. But I also think it's an exciting time. I think it's a time where those of us who've been in this struggle for a long period of time, and mine dates back more than 25 years now, of working on issues of social justice, as you mentioned, both from the nonprofit side, from the corporate side, I've done a stint in government, and I've been the president of a foundation. So I've seen this from a lot of different angles, and I think we're in a unique moment right now in our history. And so, you can look at this as a glass is half full, and we can find ourselves, this is people of all races, because quite frankly, given COVID and all the things that are happening in this country, we can find ourselves very dispirited and really wondering, what happens next? What's the next shoe that's going to drop? That's going to, affect all of our lives. And I think the death of Mr. Floyd and the 1-2 punch of COVID has left many people really doubting and wondering what the future looks like. But I also think there's an opportunity built in there. And so I'm excited tonight to talk about what that might look like for us as a nation going forward, and particularly around the role of business. Look, I'm an MBA, like those on the phone, and And I'm always interested in how do you activate business in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion. I've spent a lot of years doing that. I've run that at some major corporations. I'm running that platform now at PwC. And so that's it. That's a very, very interesting moment from my perspective. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm doing okay. I'm doing well, and I'm excited to be here with everybody tonight.
It's great to hear, and it's quite refreshing to hear your positivity with all that that's going on. So thank you for expressing, that positive outlook. It's interesting because I kind of share some of that history. My first career coming out of college was working for Teach for America, and serving as a high school teacher in a predominantly Black community in the Mississippi Delta. So definitely a different perspective as well. But I think what we're all here today to talk about is really the role of, especially in your expertise, of businesses, right, in driving a lot of the change that's needed in the social justice space. But maybe we should start out with a basic question: is how does that role change, right? Why should companies, or in this case, the corporations that you're advising and seeing, play a part in advocacy and fighting social injustice?
Yeah, well, I love the question, and I'm going to get to it, and I'm going to get to it in a roundabout way. So I want to start by giving the backdrop of a story, because I think the story helps set context, especially for people who are wondering, like, how we got here. How did we get to this moment? Not just with corporations, but with America. And so I'm going to go back and take myself back more than 25 years ago. I'm a student at UCLA. I'd moved to Los Angeles from New York, where I'd lived for my whole life on the East Coast. I'd grown up in New York and went to school at Amherst in Massachusetts undergrad. And then I moved out to California, and I was super excited. I mean, I was coming to the land of sunshine. My brother had been a student at UCLA Law, where I'd come to visit him, and I felt like this is my destiny. I got to be on this campus. And those of you who are old enough to remember or had heard about this, that was the era of Daryl Gates, Police Chief Daryl Gates in Los Angeles. And when I moved to Los Angeles, I would drive every day from my apartment in Westwood to the campus of UCLA. And I got pulled over about once a month by LAPD for no discernible reason at all. In fact, it happened so frequently that it started to, I'm a pretty calm guy by nature. I don't get upset. But, by the fifth or sixth time that this happened, I was like, what is going on? I mean, this is insane. And I started finding myself getting an anger that was building up. And finally, one day I was driving home from campus, and I noticed that I literally had to take 2 turns to get home. I went down, took a right on Wilshire, and then took a left on my road to get home. And I noticed that as soon as I turned on Wilshire, a police car started tailing me. And so you can imagine I'd been pulled over, 15 times at this point. And I'm watching this policeman, and I was like, I can't believe this is going to happen again. I made my turn into my street off of Wilshire, after going through Brentwood, and the cop lights me up. And all I can say is at this point, I was the angry Black man that they had hypothesized about, because I had it. And I remember the police officer walked up to my car, and he was standing, as they do, a little bit away from the driver's door. And when he walked up to me, I said, "What is it?" And I was hot, and the cop did a kind of a double take. I said, "What did I do? I didn't do anything." And he looked at me from where his position was, and he said, "You made an illegal U-turn on Wilshire Boulevard." And I said, I couldn't help but laugh out loud. I was like, "What?" I was like, I said, "Officer, and by the way, I'd been trained by my father to be respectful of police officers. Okay. My dad was a lawyer. And so I'd come up in a household that respected authority, but I'd had it. And I literally said, "There's no way that I made an illegal U-turn, and you were following me the whole way. So absolutely that did not happen." Okay. I said, "I make 2 turns. I made a right, and you followed me from the time I made it. I make a left, and that's my apartment building right there. And I said, there's no way that happened. So as I'm explaining myself in my, elevated tones, this guy unclicks his holster, like his gun, and he puts his hand on his weapon. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, this is serious. I remember thinking, like, okay, there's an expression that I use called being dead right. Like, you're in the right, but you're going to be dead, right? So I said, this is a dead right moment. Like, I got to stop escalating this because this ends badly, right? And so I ended up de-escalating it, but I never forgot that moment. And people ask me, so today, what's changed? Where are we today with police versus community, and why are businesses getting involved? And what I would say is, in the African American community, what we saw with Mr. Floyd is not new. This has been going on for generations, okay? For generations. And I have a lot of white friends and friends from other ethnicities who are like, no way, that didn't. And I tell them not only my story, I tell them the story of my granduncle who lived in Atlanta, was in his 20s, was driving a nice car in the 1930s, right? This is way back when. And he always drove a nice car because his family had money, and he always kept a $50 bill in his wallet. And he always told us when we were growing up, I always kept a $50 bill. And he got pulled over, and he got thrown into jail for driving a nice car. And in fact, he told the story to us that a lynch mob formed outside the jail because they couldn't believe that a black man could have a car and a $50 bill in his wallet. And were it not for a white man who knew him, who intervened and said, no, that's one of the Hamilton family members, one of the brothers of the Hamilton family, and they let him out, my uncle would have been dead. And this was my granduncle who went on to be a dean at Morehouse, and whose wife went on to be the first African-American woman ever elected to the Georgia state legislature. And he would have been dead in his 20s. And I tell this story just because this backdrop is really important. Like, we are in an era now that is building off of eras that we've lived through in the past. And so when you start thinking about, like, how is this affecting corporate America? The broader question is how should it be affecting America? And then what's corporate America's role in this? And I will tell you, from my perspective, we're living through a moment in history that is the defining moment for this nation. Make no mistake about it. If we can't grapple with these challenging issues of race right now, the nation that we know and that we believe in will not exist. And I don't mean America will go away. I mean the America that my kids and your kids and our grandkids will inherit will look very, very different than the one that we hope and aspire this nation to be. And so I think this is a defining moment. Now, businesses have an imperative now. And it's very different from what we might have seen when I came out of grad school 25, 30 years ago. And the difference is this situation is not only critical for America, it's critical for business to get involved. It's critical because business is being confronted by a number of different factors, one of which is the demand side has changed. So we see that with the public's reaction, right? We see people demanding that companies do more. I've got this interesting note that I picked up off the internet a little while ago from a young man. I'll see if I can pull it up here while we're speaking. A young man who was part of Black Lives Matter, and he was responding to something that a business executive had posted online, and the business executive had basically said, "We support Black Lives Matter," and the young man responded, "Thank you for your Black Lives Matter graphic. Now may I please see a picture of your executive leadership team and your board of directors," right?
Right.
And what that's saying is, it's no longer
walk the talk, right?
Exactly.
Like, yeah.
You're not going to get away with just saying I support Black Lives Matter. That's a really important shift, right? Because once upon a time, 15 years ago or so, you could easily say, we support this and we're anti-racist, and that was it. And then you could go back to business as usual. That's not what's going to happen in this era. It's a different era. And then the second thing, and the reason why corporations need to pay attention, is because we are now in an era where, and by the way, it doesn't matter to me whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, so let me just put that on the table. but we are in an era where government is receding from its responsibilities in the social space. And so therefore, at this particular point in time, if America is going to survive and thrive, somebody's got to pick up that slack. Corporations have the resources, the talent, the ability, and in their own self-preservation, they have a need to be able to allow America to continue to build consumers, to continue to attract talented people, and grow their employee base in the ways that will allow them to sustain themselves. And so in America in particular, in an era where government is receding, there is a huge opening and a really important need for companies to step in. And that's, again, I'm back to what, can you be excited about this or should we be depressed? And I honestly think it's a moment where we can look at it through that angle and say it's an opportunity for all of us who are in the world of business.
Thank you so much for not only bringing your personal story into that narrative, but also explaining kind of the interesting moment that we're in. One of the questions that many of us have been wondering is, and I think you may have been wondering about this too, is why did it take so long, right? We have, let me just give you an example, and this isn't exactly a Black Lives example, but it's an example that's lingered for a long time, where there have been calls forever for, say, like the Cleveland Indians or the Washington Redskins to change their name. And then now, all of a sudden, these organizations have awoken and are implementing these changes. But it took decades for that to happen. Where is that pressure coming from that is finally sparking so many visible corporate actions today versus, a lot of these organizations lagging and dragging their feet for decades?
Yeah, well, I think there's a simple answer to that, and it's this, right? I mean, this has changed things in a way that maybe we hadn't been able to visibly see in front of our faces what was actually happening, and now the cell phone, with its ability to capture video, has brought that home for us in a way that before we hadn't been exposed to. But I think part of people ask that question often, like, why is it that diversity efforts haven't been successful to this point? Maybe it's not just that we haven't been awakened, but even those who ostensibly have been awakened haven't necessarily been effective in corporate America in implementing, sweeping change and strategies around D&I. And one of the things that I think is really important to point out is this notion of creating and gaining an authentic voice, right? And here's what I mean by that. And I published an article on this online on LinkedIn for those of you who'd like to look at it, called The Diversity Paradox, a few months ago. But here's what I mean by that. So if you think about America and what wins in American corporations is those who can tell stories. And telling stories requires an authentic voice. And what we've lacked in corporate America, when we do training on diversity, we say, okay, you're going to go through, bias training, anti-bias training, and you're going to go through this and unconscious bias training. And what we've been missing is this notion of how do you get to genuine empathy, right? Because empathy becomes the distinguishing factor that enables us to have an authentic voice. And when we have an authentic voice, now we can be an advocate. Now, let me give you a real example of that. I chaired the board of the United Way here in Seattle a few years ago. I'm still active and on that board. And one of the things that we did at the United Way, which we still do in Seattle, is we have this massive event every year for homelessness. Now, I've always had a place in my heart for those who are homeless, but I never really had an experience with homeless people. I never really understood. I didn't have empathy for homeless people. And you can imagine at this event that the United Way runs every year, 2,000 to 3,000 homeless people show up at the stadium where the Seahawks play. And inside of that stadium are these 150 different booths that are available for a homeless person. So they line up outside and you can come in and get your hair cut. You can go through job interviews. You can get an internet address. You can get new shoes and clothes. you can get mammograms. If you're a woman, you can get your teeth fixed. So all of these different services are laid out all over the floor. And when that person walks in the room, they're met by one of 400 corporate volunteers. And the corporate volunteer's job is to have a checklist of all the services that are available. And I've done this almost every year. Literally, you say, okay, what would you like to have happen today to the homeless person? Now, often for a homeless person, this is the first time that they've had somebody serve them in maybe in a very, very long time. And so now I have an opportunity to exchange with that person. And for the next hour or so, I walk around with that person from station to station, helping them to get the things that they need. Now, what happens in that hour invariably is I share my story and they share their story. And by the end of that hour, and at the end of it, you can sit down and have some coffee or have some lunch if you want to, or you can go on to the next person. But my point is, at the end of that story, at the end of that time period, I have stories now. I have stories that I can tell on behalf of somebody of a person who's homeless. And of the 400 volunteers or so that go to that event every year, most of them walk away and say, that was the best event I've ever been to in my career. And the reason they say that is because it's a personal experience, it's interactive, and maybe most importantly, you walk away from it saying, you know what, I misjudged what a homeless person is, because there, but for the grace of God, go I. Most of the people that you meet are not drug addicts. They're not crazy people. They're someone who had something happen in their life that caused them to lose everything, and they didn't have a safety net. And so therefore you see single moms who are living in their car. You see elderly people who don't have any other form of support. And my point with that is, for me personally, and for others who've been through that, what it gave me was empathy and then stories to be able to tell in my own voice how to advocate for homeless people. Now, the reason why that's important is, if you think about it, change homeless people to people with disabilities, or change homeless people to people of color. Our storytelling and our empathy is from experience. And if we don't have those experiences, we can't tell the story. So if I train a room full of white executives on D&I, but none of them know any Black people, or none of them know any Latino people, none of them have ever been exposed to that group of people in any deep and meaningful way, guess what? They will not be able to have the empathy that when they stand up in front of their team and try to say to their team, here's why we're doing this, it won't be conveyed with an authentic voice. Gaining that authentic voice requires gaining some empathy. And you do that through a variety of different ways that companies can do it. I mean, I'll give you one other example. So when I was in corporate America, I was over employee resource groups. And one of the things that we did was we assigned an executive to be the mentor for each of our employee resource groups. And I decided I was going to be, my first year, I was going to be over the group of people with disabilities. Why? Because I didn't know anything about them. And I was like, I'm not going to be over the African-American group. I know I can be a part of that. I want to be over a group that I don't. So in that first year, I spent time learning about the challenges that people with disabilities had, helping them to solve problems in the workplace. And then I became a champion for that, right? Because I had that interpersonal opportunity. And so companies have the ability to be able to bring those worlds together experientially through corporate social responsibility, through volunteer efforts, through employee resource groups. I often say to business executives, with respect to the challenges we're going through now with race, if you've never in your career been the only one in the room, you need to figure out a way to make that happen. Because there's no way you will better understand what it's like to be a Black person in corporate America, or a person of color in corporate America, than when you realize what it feels like to be the only one in the room. And I tell executives all the time, I'm the only one in the room every single day. So, I mean, it's like that. Right. That's where I am, right? And so how can you be empathetic with what I feel if you've never let yourself be what I call intentionally uncomfortable? Like, find a situation where you can make yourself be the only one in the room, because that will help you to understand, oh, that's what it feels like when I'm the only white person in a room full of Asians or Latinos or Black people. And I have to figure out how to navigate my way through that world. And it's hard. And your empathy will start to come from those kinds of experiences. So I know that's a very long-winded answer, but don't get me rolling over here because I'll keep going.
No, you're on a roll. This is we love your kind of honest perspective and the fact that you're drawing from your experience. And I can definitely concur about being being the challenge of being the only one in the room, and how it helps you see things from a completely different perspective.
Absolutely.
But that is a huge challenge that I think every executive is grappling with under COVID conditions, right? Where you see the people marching and all this action taking place, but as a company, your hands are in many ways tied because of the fact that there's still a pandemic going around, and you're not encouraging your employees to leave and doing a lot of activism, right? And so I guess my question is, we've seen a lot of companies take these visible symbolic actions to rally their troops, and some of the ones that I've seen are, for instance, Walmart announcing that they're no longer going to lock, black hair products that the Black community uses behind locked shelves, right? Or Aunt Jemima being retired as a brand because it's in a lot of ways racist. But besides these symbolic changes that the companies can make, have you seen any movement towards the real change that you had alluded to earlier? The what about your executive leadership team is diverse in any way? Are you seeing a movement towards recommitting to those long-term D&I goals that companies have always had on the periphery, but never or for many companies never successfully implemented?
Yeah. So I love the question. So let me say this. I think that one of the things that often comes up with corporations and with senior executives and with CEOs is, hey, look, we did something. We put an ad in the Wall Street Journal and we said we're against racism. We republished our company's values and we made them clear to people. We made a statement that Black lives do matter, right? And all those are important, but I want us to distinguish between gestures and actions, right? So a gesture is, gee, we put out a statement, and that's not a bad thing, but don't confuse that with actions that actually use the power, weight, scale, force of a company to get at the root causes of this situation that we find ourselves in. And those, ultimately, this is about position and power and equity, right? I mean, those are the things. And so how do you use the weight and scale, or how do we use the weight and scale of corporate America to go beyond we released a statement? And by the way, even taking actions, I mean, there are different levels of actions, right? So on level one, an action might be, we convened a dialogue. Well, again, important thing. But the analogy I use is, if anybody's ever run a road race, convening a dialogue is the equivalent of, I stretched this morning, I put on my running gear, and I showed up at the starting gate, right? Like there's nothing wrong with that, but you haven't run the race. Like that's not, like that's not the equivalent of actually taking the next 2 or 3 steps to be able to say, I'm having an impact on actually changing society. I'm using, my scale and weight as a force for good. And the thing that's really so important about that from a corporate side is to think about it in the context of sustainability. Because if a company looks at this through just a prism of altruism, in other words, if they just say, you know what, we want this to be a philanthropic exercise, so we're going to write a check for $500,000 a year, and we're going to give it to a nonprofit organization that's serving the African-American population, just making that up, right? That's a good gesture, but that's not sustainable, right? And what I mean by that is the way that this gets to be sustainable is when there's a social ROI and a return on investment for the company. So there's a business proposition around D&I. There's a business imperative that says, when we do this, we do better in the marketplace. There's a lot of data to back this up, by the way. So this isn't something that isn't correlated to data. But if you think about it, if we hire from low-income populations, how does that affect us as a company? How does that affect our turnover rates? Do our turnover rates go down? Do we have a business impact that we can see? If we do more, if we use our volunteer army, a lot of companies don't think about it. They have an army of volunteers that can go out and do positive things in a community, like the homeless event I described a few minutes ago. Well, when we turn those people loose, that's what when I say demand driven, that's what employees want from their corporations today, right? They want their corporations to help them to figure out, how do I give back? How do you create a mechanism for me? At PwC, we just, our CEO, Tim Ryan, just announced a few weeks ago that every single PwC employee, whatever your level, will now have 40 hours a year to donate to community service. And by the way, we're a company that does billable hours and all that, but you get to credit those as if you're doing billable work, which is unbelievable, right? So now we've unleashed our army to be able to go out and attack the issues that are out there. And that's to the benefit of the company, because it increases employee engagement and reduces turnover, gets people more excited, attracts people to come to this place, right? So we get a higher caliber of people who want to join an organization like that. And at the same time, it's doing well and doing good. It's doing good things for society. And so it's that symbiotic relationship that I think companies need to think about to be more effective in this, and that double bottom line ROI. And then the last thing I'll say is, look, for many years, and I think if you go back and you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion in corporate America, it was a dangling participle. It was something that was hung out over here as an appendage to the organization. It's like, okay, well, we'll get a CDO. We'll put that person over here in a corner office. They have no staff, no budget. And we get to check the box and say, well, we got a chief diversity officer. So, if some issue comes up, we're like, Fred, what do you think about that? Because you're the chief diversity officer. And it was an appendage, right? It wasn't the most successful companies who are thinking this through and who have moved the needle have realized that, no, that's not the way to do it. Diversity, equity, and inclusion needs to be woven into the very fabric of your business. Every business decision you make, whether it's marketing, finance, operations, needs to be viewed through the prism of how are you going to do this with a D&I lens, right? And therefore, rather than having that person sit in an office by themselves, that person becomes integrated and an integral part of every single business decision that you're making. That's where this needs to go. And I do think that companies are waking up to those things. I mean, they're recognizing that it can't be an appendage. They're recognizing that in order to be sustainable, it has to have a return on investment. Companies will continue to do things that pay dividends for the company. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's, profitability is not a four-letter word. It's actually something that can work in our favor in terms of sustaining, right, the efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, I think we're at an important kind of pivotal moment where some of those old paradigms and approaches are finally starting to break down a little bit. And that's an exciting thing to see.
Yeah, love those examples. I think the PwC example is really interesting because it's basically the company giving every employee cover to pursue the cause, right? And I think that's and not only is it cover, but doing so is celebrated, which I think is absolutely critical to be able to, really put your time and your money where your mouth is as a company.
And that by the way is reflective of your culture, right? Yeah. And so people talk about what kind of culture do we have, or what kind of culture do we want, and in order to build and sustain that culture, you've got to be taking active steps that bring your values to life for your people. So so I'm excited about that.
Yeah. One of the questions I had, and this is a great segue to what you mentioned about, making sure that diversity and the CDO is a part of every decision that's being made. I think we see a bifurcation of companies that have successfully done something basic from a D&I standpoint, which is to diversify its workforce, versus companies that have had trouble doing that for years, right? And it's funny that in your experience at Starbucks, because to me, I see Starbucks as one of the companies as, that has definitely been relatively successful in making sure that their workforce reflects the population in the U.S. at large. But there are many other companies that are struggling to do that. I think recently we've seen a lot of results in the tech industry where technology companies have been committing to diversifying their workforce for years, and then a decade has passed and they've managed to only increase their Black and brown employees by a couple of percentage points. Do companies need to start rethinking their approach here? Like, it's one thing to say we want to do it, but then the results kind of speak for themselves, and relatively success and failures. What are these companies doing wrong, and how do they broaden their approach in order to make those numbers actually move?
Well, first let's just be real here, okay? Which I can't help but be, but I'm gonna be real on this subject. So in many instances, this is new muscle, right? So if you think about it from the analogy of sort of working out, where you've been laying back for 6 or 9 months and you haven't worked out, and all of a sudden you decide, I'm going to start running again. Yeah. And the pain that you go through, right, is hard, right? Yeah. And so you got to recognize that if this isn't something that you've been working at for some period of time, there's going to be some soreness, there's going to be some pain, but it will lead you to a better place, to a healthier place, playing that analogy out, and maybe even longer life, if you think about it in terms of corporate longevity. But there's a couple of thoughts in there that I think are really important, especially in the era that we're living through right now. So one is, I take a look at companies today who have committed themselves to diversity, and I'm looking at what are they doing through this crisis moment. And what I mean by that is you can always tell what somebody's true values are by where they're spending their time and money in a crisis, right? Because ultimately the things that float to the top during a crisis are the things that you really care about. And even we're in the midst of a crisis right now. There's no doubt about it, with COVID in particular. And that can be deemed as an economic crisis and maybe a social crisis and a whole bunch of other things. But in many ways, the companies that are doubling down on their efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion right now, and this is hard for me to say, but I'm going to say it, they may be the only ones who actually ever really cared about it in the first place. Because they're saying, you know what, no, we're not going to lose our focus on this. We're not going to lose our intensity. We're going to double down. We're going to do the right thing. And we believe that ultimately this is not only going to help us in the long run, it's going to help pull us out of this economic malaise that we may find ourselves in. And those are the ones that I think get the bright star right now. And then, in terms of just practically speaking, as I was talking about sort of D&I being an appendage to an organization, if you think about, if somebody takes a look at their board, just going back to that quote from the Black Lives Matter, somebody takes a look at their board, takes a look at their senior team, and doesn't see any diversity, recognize that that is a barrier, that you're sending a signal to the marketplace, whether it's overtly or not, that doesn't matter to you. And so, if diversity is to be successful in a company, it needs to be, as I said earlier, woven into the fabric of an organization. And maybe most importantly, it needs to start at the top. And there needs to be a commitment that says, no, we're going to have a board that's diverse. And we know that that's going to pay dividends for us, particularly as the nation begins to become a majority nation. And we're going to focus on issues that are of importance to people of color, to people with disabilities, to other historically disenfranchised groups. And so we are going to do that. We're going to make that commitment. We're going to look at our senior team and understand whether we have representation that we need to be able to look and feel and sound more like America. And we recognize, and we're going to look at the business impact of that, because we expect that it's going to help our business over time. And so those are a few of the things that I think are really important for companies to be thinking about right now. And again, it gets back to this notion of how do we make diversity not a stand alone into and of itself, but how do we weave it into the very fabric and the way that we're thinking about our business and our model and our go-to-market strategies? You know, ERGs, employee resource groups, great example, right? Most companies created employee resource groups years ago. Most, not all, but most. And many have them. And there are these groups of people who meet and have conversations, and that can be very important and very supportive. But how do you take an ERG and weave it into the fabric of your company? How do you, if you're building a new product that you need to penetrate in the Latino market, how do you go to that group of Latinos and say, you know what, we need you to help us design this product. We need you to help us figure out how to penetrate this new market. When you do that, you will not only get more success in bringing them closer to the business with whatever you're designing or building, but quite frankly, you're going to excite those employees who are like, wow, it's fantastic to be Latino at this company, because they're really excited about me and putting me in the middle of the plans for the future success of the company. So it's a bi-directional win for the employee and for the organization. So I think there are ways of doing this that will stretch the success maybe a little more than what we've seen in the past.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned the ERGs and the business case, because one of the questions I would want to ask, but I think you just answered, which is how do you do D&I in a way that minimizes dissent, right? And because we've seen what happened in for instance Google, right, when D&I goals all of a sudden gets a backlash from the relative conservative elements of the employee base, for instance. And alluding to kind of the way you're talking about celebrating diversity through ERGs, through expanding the market, through business goals, to reorient employees towards kind of fundamentally what's successful from a diversity standpoint is going to be successful for our business, could be one way to be able to get almost all of your employees on board for those goals.
Yeah, totally agree. And the other piece though is, again, exercising that new muscle. You gotta understand you're gonna have some dissenters. You're gonna have some pain when you go through it. There's no decision that a company makes that pleases everybody: shareholders, employees, management, labor. There are decisions that companies make every single day that they realize aren't going to be winners across the entire spectrum necessarily, but are in the best interest of the company in the long term. And in some cases, that's going to be the case here. Everybody is not going to be super excited about every single decision that a company makes with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion. Recognize that going in, right? And just try to live your values, right? These companies all have values. And if we can get companies to say, let's live the values, let's make sure we're bringing them to life in our actions, as I said, not just our gestures, but in our actual actions and deeds. And you mentioned Howard Schultz, and Howard is a wonderful man and my former boss. And I've seen Howard stand up in front of a room of people in a shareholders meeting and say to a shareholder, you know what, if you don't think that this company is doing the right thing by you, you're free to not be a shareholder anymore, right? And saying that in a public forum. I've seen Tim Ryan, our CEO of PwC, stand up and say, you know what, we're going hard after diversity, equity, inclusion. We're specifically going to double down on doing the right thing by African-American population. We're going to look at our business decisions through this lens. And you know what, if you're not comfortable with that, this might not be the firm for you. Like there has to be some boldness. And when dissent comes, you have to say, no, this is our values. This is who we are, right? And we're going to stand by this. And by the way, it may not be the right place for everybody anymore. And that's okay, because you ultimately want to continue to evolve. Corporations want to continue to evolve as much as we do as human beings, right? Like we should be evolving over time and trying to get better. And sometimes that requires, going through a little bit of dissent and a little bit of pain to get there.
So I'm conscious of time and would love if we can open it up for questions. I do see that there's a few in the Q&A pod. Any good ones, Frank, to pose?
Yeah, I got a couple. So we have one from Henry Hernandez. And the question is, my name is Henry Hernandez Jr. Anderson class of 85 and over 25 years of experience in D&I as Chief Diversity Officer and consulting assignments. I was just appointed to the Rice University Business Task Force on Inequality and Social Justice. What would you see as hot points for a business school to address?
Yeah, so it's amazing because the question is really, are our business schools training leaders with the skills that they need, particularly around this subject in the 21st century? And so I would start with curriculum, and just asking and probing into the tough questions around what does our curriculum look like? Are we, in fact, do we have professors on the campus who are able to, from experience, and I mean current experience, are able to actually talk about and teach the students the kinds of things that they'll need to be able to unlock their future in this space as business leaders. And by the way, I don't mean that they're going to emerge to be a chief diversity officer necessarily. I mean, to be an effective CEO, over the next 25 years. Are they getting the right grounding in diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are we framing it in our schools and through our educational systems, not as a nice to do, but as an imperative? And I would take a hard look at the curriculum. I'd start there. And then again, business schools are just organizations, right? And so just as we talked about with respect to companies, business schools need to look at their staffing and ask some tough questions about whether their staffing reflects American society, not just today, but where it's going, and how much diversity is within their ranks, particularly for those who are in the classroom, but also for the administrators. That matters a great deal. Many students are making their decisions just like employees are making their decisions about what companies to go work for based on their commitment to communities. Students are making their decisions about what schools to go to based on what that student and faculty population looks like. So, it can become a self-fulfilling downward prophecy if your staffing and your student body do not reflect what America. So I would say those two things are probably the most important that come to mind. And by the way, I've spent a lot of time in the field of education over the years, and my own assessment is, we got a ways to go before we're actually training students the way that they need to be trained for the 21st century, even in the great business schools that are out there.
It's a great point, because business schools also need to evolve, right, as the market shifts
Absolutely.
beneath them. So I think it's a very, very good question. I'm very curious. Do you think that now is the right time for business schools to add potentially a D&I course to their curriculum, to their core curriculum?
I honestly think it's mandatory. I don't even think it's nice. I wouldn't even frame it as, is it the right time? I'd say, without it, we are not doing justice to the workforce of the future. We're just not. We're tying a hand behind their back and sending them out, and they're not going to be as effective as they need to be if they really don't understand what those challenges and what those opportunities look like over the next 20 years. So 100%, I think it's mandatory.
Okay, great. All right, Frank, any other questions?
We do. So from Norbert Tan, from class of 96, you actually met with him 20 years ago. His question is there value in earning a certificate in diversity and inclusion? There are a bunch of programs out there, including a Cornell 2-month program. As an Asian American, while I bring a personal lived experience, would an official certificate help me with credibility in my consulting and executive coaching practice? Thanks.
Yeah, so I love the question, but it's also one that's hard for me to answer, right? Because there's so much variation in certificates and courses that are out there. Let me just say this. I think if you go to a credible university and or a credible training, I don't think it's going to hurt you. Like are you going to pick up some things that are helpful? Yes. But I think there's also things that we just need to practice as leaders. As I said earlier, practice the notion of making yourself intentionally uncomfortable. Practice the notion of trying to build empathy and an authentic voice by engaging with people that you need to gain a better understanding of. I mean, I think those real life experiences and sort of charting our own course on this is also very, very important for us as leaders. And you know, certificates and training, I'm not against them, but I've also seen a huge variance in terms of effectiveness. So it's very hard to say, you know, yes, that will be a tremendous boost to your career. Does it look good on a resume? Probably, right? And does it move the needle for you? It may, it may not. So it's a tough one for me to answer without, you know, really taking a look at what the curriculum is and even having some experiences with it myself.
All right. Personally, I'm an advocate of Cornell undergrad, but we'll leave it at that. Frank, go ahead for the next question.
Okay, the next one we have from our audience is from Tony Belcher. D&I efforts have been going on as long as I have been alive. How do you not scare the majority, especially if some of the words and phrases that could come up are emotionally and defensively charged, such as racism, white privilege, and others?
Yeah, I love that one.
Great question. Yeah.
How do you not scare the majority? Well, you know, let me just say, again, in the spirit of empathy, part of what you have to understand is that other people have been scared for a long, long time, and yes, we don't want to frighten people into inaction here. Like, that wouldn't be helpful. But we've got to confront this. Like, this has been the third rail of American business and American discourse for a long period of time. And so I think where we find ourselves now is we're faced with an imperative. This isn't a nice to do. You know, somebody can't hide under a rock and hope the storm passes over here. This is a permanent shift, and that's why I said it's such a historical moment. This is a permanent shift to America, right? What we're seeing happening in the streets and the demonstrations, I've never seen that before. I've been in this space for more than 25 years, pushing it from all angles. I've never seen this happen before, where you've got, you know, a demonstration in Portland where and other cities where the majority who are out are not people of color who are demonstrating. And what that symbolizes, and what that shows, is this moment is different. And, you know, people ask, is it a moment or is it a movement? I think it's a movement. 100% think it's a movement. And so, you know, does that scare the majority who may feel like we have everything to lose and not so much to gain in this? Perhaps. But I think, candidly, if you're scared, you're looking at this the wrong way. Number one, you're looking at it as a zero-sum game, which is, if somebody else wins, it means I lose. I reject that premise. I don't think this is a zero-sum game. I think this is a grow the pie game, right? Where everybody can win more. And number two, if you're thinking that I'm going to be a loser in this, I think you're missing the point about the moment that we're living through in history and the opportunity that we have to help shape the future of this country and the future of American business in a way that pays dividends for generations to come. You know, they talk about previous generations and the one that grew up and served in World War II. They talk about that as the greatest generation because of the sacrifices that they made. And they did well, but they made sacrifices and did things like fought a world war and, you know, all of the things that they sacrificed on behalf of the country. What are the people that are intrinsic in that question willing to sacrifice, if anything? I mean, that, you know, and I'm not saying you need to give up tremendous amounts of your wealth or privilege or whatever, but you do need to understand that that in order for us to move to the next stage of growth in this country, there's going to need to be some adjustments, and those adjustments are going to be hard in some moments. They're not going to be easy. There's no change that America has ever made of significance. Again, go back to the American Revolution. There's no change that we've made that hasn't been hard. There's also no significant change that we've made that I can think of that hasn't come from a force outside of us that's forced us to change, right? It's not like we woke up and said, gee, I think we'll free the slaves. No, that's not exactly the way that went down, right? I mean, we've been forced to do something, right? Either something has shifted in the landscape, either there's been a war or an outbreak or an uprising, either another country's put pressure on us that's forced us to do something, right? That's how we've entered into wars, or times have changed and civil unrest has caused us to do so. Like, we're in one of those moments. It is a tumultuous moment of change, right? Rather than running away from it, embrace it, right? Figure out how can you best be a part of that? How can you sustain yourself and help others? How can you grow the pie through this? As opposed to thinking about what I'll lose, think about what you and we will gain from this moment. And I think it's a different perspective. And my hope is that we can embrace that collectively. I'm not naive. I recognize that won't be easy, but I think that's the opportunity that we have in front of us. So I appreciate the question. It's a good one.
Yeah, I appreciate the question too. And the part that I would want to challenge is the premise that these terms scare the majority. From the way I see it, is truly is a moment when the majority is embracing, and embracing the change. And the one example that I always highlight is, never in my lifetime would I imagine that a majority Republican legislature and governor in Mississippi would vote to remove the Confederate flag.
Right.
That is the power of this movement, in a sense that, it has galvanized both parties in our government into action. And I think it's time to embrace terms like racism and privilege, because that's where our country is headed.
But what's interesting though, people can sleep through moments in history, like, and often, somebody will awaken 25 years after that moment and say, wow, that's a big moment. I didn't really know it was big. Like, you're living through one of those moments right now. Like, this is a defining moment in the history of this country. Make no mistake about it. And so let's recognize that, right? Let's not wait 25 years and go, wow, I slept through the civil rights movement of the 1960s or whatever it was that somebody didn't realize was going on until 25 years later. If we embrace it, as opposed to running from it, if we take on our fears and change them into looking at this through the prism of opportunity, I think that's a tremendous, and I bring that down even to an individual level. It's a tremendous opportunity for all of us if we go about it through that methodology.
All right, let's do one more question, Frank.
I think we're out of questions, actually.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it just discussion in the Q&A? Yeah. Hello, all. No questions. Love this.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Oh,
that's
fantastic.
okay.
Oh,
We didn't want them to stump the panel anyway. So it's all good.
I thought there was like a line of questions ready to go.
It's okay.
Well, I just wanted once again to thank you, Blair, for providing so much great perspective and almost personal examples, from when you were in business school to the work that you've done. Because I do completely agree. I think most of us, can find greater empathy in being able to share in the experiences that you had, because we have never been exposed to the challenges that someone of a different skin color, especially in the Black community, has.
Yeah.
And so I think your perspective is important. It makes sure that many of us can empathize, right, and find our own ways to be able to support the movement. And I also want to encourage everyone on this call to continue, be exposing yourself, finding opportunities to be the only one in the room, and finding ways that you are comfortable supporting, what's happening in this movement, but comfortable in the way that is for you, especially for the fact that we have a global pandemic going on. So every person, makes a decision based on, what you want to do and what your risk appetite is, I guess, in today's age. Any final thoughts, Blair, before we let you go?
No, I just want to say thank you. I mean, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the, we were talking right before we got on here about fatigue from Zoom and, fatigue from webinars and webcasts. So thank you to all of you who tuned in and stuck with us for the hour. Really appreciate that.
Are you kidding?
And,
this was an energizing conversation. I'm definitely fatigued by the work meetings.
Yeah.
This refills my tank
Yeah,
for
I
sure.
appreciate that. I appreciate that. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to just continuing the work and just continuing to be a part of the Anderson network. So thank you all.
Thank you, Blair.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Anderson Seattle Alumni Chapter and all other chapters, thanks again, everyone. And the work doesn't end here. It's really up to us as individuals to continue having these conversations to change beliefs, cultures, and business fabrics. Please reach out to me through either Facebook or our alumni page if you have any feedback or suggestions for future events.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks.
Take care, everyone.